Chapter 1. The sun had barely set over the village of Crampton Lee when the trouble began, although, as Miss Marple would later point out, it had been simmering long before. It was Tuesday, and that meant dinner at the vicarage. A tradition for over 15 years, these suppers were quiet affairs, filled with stew, sherry, and the occasional slip of scandal beneath the silverware. But tonight, the air was different. A subtle tightness, like a thread pulled too taut. "Do wish you'd pass the pepper, Nora," said Reverend Miles Bartram, folding his napkin with clerical neatness. "The stew's a touch bland tonight." Mrs. Nora Bartram, his wife of 33 dutiful years, didn't reply. She stared into her bowl, unmoving. "Darling," he pressed, setting down his spoon, "you've not touched yours. The rest of the table, Dr. Edwin Toller, Mrs. Petunia Swain, young Simon Bexley from the post office, and Miss Marple herself," followed his gaze. Nora's spoon slipped from her hand. It clinked against the porcelain. Then she collapsed, silently, face down into the stew. It was Petunia who screamed first. Not the piercing sort, but a gasping, drawn-back noise that turned more heads than the fool had. Dr. Toller was already out of his chair, knocking over a teacup in the process. Simon stood frozen, mouth parted as though the air had gone too thick to breathe. Miss Marple, ever composed, tilted her head ever so slightly. "Don't move her," said the doctor, his voice firm. "Let me." He leaned in, fingers at Nora's neck, jaw set. The room held its breath. "She's dead," he said at last, voice flat. "Cardiac arrest, perhaps." "Surely not," murmured the vicar, as though death in his kitchen was a breach of divine contract. "She was perfectly well this morning." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the stove, where the pot still bubbled faintly. A curl of steam danced toward the rafters. "We must call the police," said Petunia, wringing her napkin. "Or someone." Simon, the only one with a motor bicycle, was dispatched. As the front door banged shut, Miss Marple stepped lightly around the table, eyes lingering for a beat too long on the near-empty stew pot. Her expression was unreadable. "Perhaps," she murmured gently, "we ought to preserve whatever remains of supper, just in case." No one argued. It was 2 hours before Inspector Cray arrived from the county station. His moustache twitched with impatience as he took down statements in the Bartrams' drawing-room. Miss Marple sat quietly by the fireplace, her knitting untouched on her lap. "The doctor says natural causes," the inspector announced at last, folding his notebook. "Until the coroner says otherwise, that's what I'll go with." "Would it be terribly forward," Miss Marple said lightly, "to ask whether anyone examined the stew?" Cray raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am? Well, it just seems so sudden, doesn't it?" Her eyes twinkled. One moment enjoying supper, the next gone. "It happens," said Cray. "Heart, stroke, who knows?" Miss Marple smiled thinly. "But of all places, in the kitchen. It's such a tidy room for something so final." Cray gave a grunt and closed his notebook. Outside, the village remained as it always had. Quiet, pastoral, full of roses and routines. But inside the vicarage, the kitchen had turned cold. Chapter 2. By the next morning, the village of Crampton Lee had exchanged its usual serenity for something more brittle, like porcelain just beginning to crack. At the High Street bakery, Conversation dropped to a murmur whenever the vicarage was mentioned. At the grocer's, Miss Gilly Crouch handed out change with a distracted hand and a shaken expression. No one said the word murder, but no one said heart attack either. Miss Marple sipped her tea on the garden bench just after dawn, as was her habit. The air carried the scent of honeysuckle and something less lovely, fear perhaps, or speculation. She watched the lane from behind her roses. Nothing stirred until Petunia Swain came marching up, coat buttoned crookedly and cheeks pink with tension. "I'm sorry to intrude, Miss Marple," Petunia blurted before she'd even reached the gate. "But, oh, I just can't sit in that house alone. I keep hearing stew bubbling, though there's nothing on the stove." "Then you must sit here instead," Miss Marple replied warmly. "Tea?" Petunia nodded, eyes darting toward the sky, as though trying to shake off some dark mist that clung to her. "She was fine, you know," Petunia said softly, once the tea had been poured. "Nora. A bit brittle lately, perhaps, but not ill. Not that ill." Brittle? She'd been sharp these past few weeks. Nervous. She wasn't herself. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Do go on." Petunia hesitated. "It's not my place. Only she mentioned something odd last week. Said there was something in the house that didn't belong. Or someone. What did she mean by that?" I don't know. She was vague. Said it was just a feeling, that she kept waking in the night and thinking the kitchen window was open. But it wasn't." Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "And did she say anything else?" Petunia nodded. "She said she didn't like the smell of the stew any more. She always made the Tuesday stew, but last week she said it smells wrong. Off, somehow." The vicarage, Inspector Cray, was finishing a round of follow-up interviews. Reverend Bartram looked hollow-eyed and subdued, his sermon notes untouched. He wore the stunned look of a man who'd had his sanctuary desecrated. "I'm telling you," the vicar murmured as Cray scribbled notes. "She was perfectly well that day. Irritated, yes, but no worse than usual. She'd misplaced her brooch that morning, tore the sitting-room apart looking for it. She'd misplaced her brooch that morning, tore the sitting-room apart looking for it." "What kind of brooch?" asked Cray without looking up. "Silver. Little forget-me-nots. Meant something to her. Her mother's, I think." "Did she find it?" "No. She accused poor Mary of moving it, but that's nonsense. Mary's been with us for 12 years. She wouldn't take a thing." Cray shut his notebook. "We'll see what the coroner says." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage herself. The kitchen had been scrubbed to sterility. No trace of stew remained. But when Mary the maid answered the door, her hands were red from scouring. "You poor thing," Miss Marple said gently. "This must be very difficult." Mary nodded, swallowing hard. "I can't sleep, miss. Not since I saw her fall. I keep thinking she's going to sit up again. Start telling me to fetch more salt." Was she particular about that sort of thing? Mary smiled faintly. "Very. Especially lately. Couldn't stand things out of place. Did she say anything odd before the dinner? She asked me twice if I'd locked the kitchen window. And had you?" Mary frowned. "I always do. Every single night." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the pantry door. It hung ajar, ever so slightly. That evening, Miss Marple took a stroll down the lane, towards the edge of the village, and she yelled, not with purpose, but with curiosity. An entirely different thing. The cottages thinned out near the fields, where the lights of Crampton Lee flickered behind her like cautious eyes. She paused outside the home of Simon Bexley, the young postman. His windows glowed with the warmth of a kettle just boiled, and opened the door before she knocked. "Miss Marple, forgive the intrusion, dear. I thought perhaps you might need a listener." He hesitated, then stepped aside. "You'd be the only one who hasn't already questioned me." Inside, the small front room was neat, but the scent of varnish hung faintly in the air. On the sideboard sat a wooden box, hinged with tiny brass clasps, unusual for a bachelor. "I didn't even eat the stew," Simon said as they sat. "Didn't get the chance. Mrs. Bartram dropped before I'd finished my sherry." "You were seated where exactly?" "At the end, near the cabinet, not close to her." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Did you notice anything unusual about the kitchen?" "Unusual?" He scratched his jaw. "Only the spice rack was different. I noticed it because the pepper was missing from its usual spot." She gave a small smile. "Curious what our minds file away without meaning to." Simon frowned. "Do you think it wasn't natural? That she didn't just—" Miss Marple didn't answer. Her eyes were on the wooden box now. The tiniest glint of silver, tarnished and petal-shaped, peeked from inside. Chapter 3. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows as Miss Marple made her way to the village green, her parasol tapping gently on the cobblestones. She had slept only lightly, her mind turning not on stew or sherry, but on silver petals peeking from a box in Simon Bexley's sitting room. The brooch. Nora Bartram's missing brooch, to be precise. The one she had reportedly torn the house apart searching for, the one she accused Mary, the maid, of moving. Now it lay tucked, half hidden, not concealed, in a bachelor's sideboard drawer. A drawer Simon hadn't seemed aware he'd left open. But Miss Marple didn't confront. Not yet. A hasty accusation could shatter the rhythm of a mystery. It was better to let the pieces rearrange themselves until they clicked. With the grocers, tongues were wagging beneath polite smiles. Mrs. Gilly-Crouch handed over a paper-wrapped wheel of Stilton and leaned in across the counter. "You've heard, haven't you, Miss Marple, about what they found in the autopsy?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Has the report been made public?" "Not officially," Jilly said with a sniff. "But it's a small village. Dr. Toller said it to the butcher's boy, who told my cousin Joan, who told me poison." A soft intake of breath. Miss Marple accepted her parcel and gave a gentle nod. "Poison can be so dreadfully impersonal, don't you think?" she murmured. "So quiet, so invisible, and yet so intimately administered." Jilly blinked. "I suppose." Miss Marple's next visit was to the vicarage. The Reverend was in his study, looking unusually rumpled. "They've confirmed it," he said without preamble. "Digitalis, in the stew." "Foxglove," Miss Marple said softly. "You know it?" "Oh, yes. Quite common in cottage gardens, but deadly in stew." The vicar rubbed his brow. "Inspector Cray asked about our flower beds. Said they'll be checking for missing cuttings. It's all rather ghoulish." "Not necessarily," Miss Marple replied. "A great many things are ghoulish when viewed too closely. But death often begins in the ordinary." She paused, then added, "Did your wife keep any medicinal herbs in the kitchen?" The vicar looked surprised. "No, not that I recall." Miss Marple didn't press, but her thoughts turned back to Simon's spice rack. The pepper misplaced, the drawer ajar. She found young Simon again by the post office, his bicycle propped against the wall. He was sorting letters with a practised flick. "You're up early," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Habit." Miss Marple smiled. "One never knows what the village might reveal at dawn." Simon didn't reply. She stepped closer. "Simon, forgive an old woman's curiosity, but where did you get that wooden box on your sideboard?" He blinked. "That? Oh, that was a gift from Mrs. Bartram." "Really?" she asked lightly. "A personal gift. I did odd jobs for them last summer. She gave me that box as thanks." Miss Marple studied his face, not his words, but the way his shoulders squared too quickly, the too careful tone. "It's a handsome piece," she said, "and quite a sentimental choice for Nora." Simon shifted. "She was like, and quite a sentimental choice for Nora." Simon shifted. "She was like that sometimes." "Did you know her well?" "Well enough." Later that day, Miss Marple walked past the vicarage garden, pausing by the flower beds. The foxglove stood tall, innocent, and deadly. But something else caught her attention. A bare patch in the corner of the plot, freshly turned earth, its edges irregular. She knelt delicately, brushing the soil. Something glinted, a jagged piece of metal, dull with age, not foxglove, something older. "Looking for clues, Miss Marple?" Inspector Cray's voice broke the silence. He stood behind her, hands in his coat pockets. "Merely admiring the vicarage gardening," she replied, brushing her gloves. "It tells a great deal about a household, you know." "Any new theories?" "Only questions. For example, why would someone put poison in stew shared among 6 people?" Cray frowned. "They didn't. Only Nora's bowl had it." "Are you certain?" "Dead certain. Lab confirmed it. 1 bowl, 1 death. Clean and deliberate." Miss Marple gave a faint nod. "Then the killer knew which bowl would be hers." "Exactly." The killer would have needed access just before serving." She left the thought dangling. That evening Miss Marple paid one last visit to Mary, the maid. The girl looked tired, her hands red raw from cleaning. "I won't stay long," Miss Marple assured her. "I just wanted to ask one thing. When you set the table that evening, did anyone come into the kitchen while you were out?" Mary hesitated. "I don't think so." "You don't think so?" "Well," Mary bit her lip. "Simon did say he forgot his gloves. He came back inside, said he'd left them near the coat rack." "And where is the coat rack?" "Just beside the kitchen door." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, not in accusation, but in thought. A boy retrieving gloves. A spice rack disturbed, a drawer ajar, a brooch hidden in plain sight. The stew had been meant for one person, but the kitchen had never truly been empty. Chapter 4. The next morning brought a rare spell of sunshine to Crampton Lee, but the brightness did little to lift the mood. Then the Blue Hen tea room, where chatter usually drifted between scone recipes and flower shows, conversations now dropped abruptly whenever the kitchen door creaked. Miss Marple, seated near the window with her knitting resting in her lap, watched the garden behind the tea room with half an eye. Ivy crept up the wall in uneven patches, and the bench beneath the apple tree remained vacant despite the fine weather. people were unsettled. That was useful. She didn't speak until Reverend Bartram entered, hat in hand, looking wearier than a man of the cloth ought to. "I hoped I might find you here," he said quietly, sliding into the seat opposite hers. "There's something I must tell you." Miss Marple only nodded, hands folding over her yarn. Nora had become convinced someone was watching her, the vicar said. Not just the window business. She said things had been moved, touched. Was anything actually missing? Nothing valuable. A napkin ring, a needle case. She said it was the pattern, not the loss, the sense of intrusion. And you didn't believe her? He hesitated. I thought she was unraveling. Her nerves weren't steady, not for months. I even asked Dr. Toller. He gave her something. She said she didn't take it. Miss Marple stirred her tea. And did you ever notice anyone lingering near the house? No, he said, except, well, young Simon is always about, but he's harmless. Miss Marple didn't reply. Later she returned to the vicarage garden. The foxgloves still swayed in the breeze, innocently decorative. But Miss Marple didn't linger there. She moved instead to the patch of turned soil she had seen the day before. She brought with her a small trowel and gloves, claiming to Mary that she was assisting with weeding. The girl was grateful for the company. Miss Marple worked slowly, carefully. Only inches down, she found it. A crumpled bit of cloth, stained with something dark. It might once have been a kitchen rag, or a handkerchief, but tucked inside, wrapped tight, was a spoon, a long-handled silver one, the kind from the Bartram's best set. The tip was dusted faintly with something pale. Not stew, not tarnish. Poison? She didn't touch it directly. Instead, she wrapped it again and tucked it into her handbag. She turned just in time to see Mary watching from the doorway. "I never saw anyone bury anything," Mary said quickly. "If I had, I don't suspect you, dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "But someone has been treating this garden like a locked cupboard." Inspector Cray looked less sceptical when she handed over the cloth-wrapped bundle an hour later. "Where'd you find this?" he asked, not brusque, but taut. "The vicarage garden," Miss Marple replied, "buried quite shallowly. It might be worth testing." Cray turned it over in his hands. "You think this was the poison delivery?" "I think someone wanted it not to be found, which amounts to the same." "Anything else?" She considered. Simon Bexley was seen re-entering the vicarage the night of the murder, under the pretext of forgotten gloves. Cray frowned. "You think the postboy's capable of murder?" "I think he's capable of secrets." Miss Marple visited Simon again that evening. This time he looked startled to see her, back so soon. "I forgot to ask something," she said sweetly. "Do you remember who served the stew that night?" E.G. blinked. "Nora did, I think. She always did. She brought in the pot, and Mary ladled it." "And did Mary hand everyone their bowls?" "No," he said slowly. "Nora passed them out. I remember because she set mine down last." She smiled, sort of distant-like. "And your bowl was clean?" He hesitated. "I didn't eat," he said again. "I had the sherry. Then it all happened." Miss Marple nodded, then turned her eyes to the little wooden box on the sideboard. "Have you worn the brooch?" Simon blinked again. What? The one in your drawer. Nora's. I didn't know it was hers. She told the vicar it was missing, days before her death. How did it end up in your box? He looked down, jaw tight. She gave it to me. As a gift, I suppose. Strange gift for a married woman to give a young man, don't you think? Simon didn't answer. That night, as Miss Marple returned home beneath a rising moon, her mind ticked quietly. A spoon buried in a garden. A brooch hidden but not sold. A woman who feared she was being watched, and a young man who insisted he hadn't eaten, though he'd been close enough to move a pepper jar. It was not guilt that gave people away. It was sentiment. She let herself into her cottage, shut the door gently, and turned the lock with a soft click. There would be another move soon, and when it came, she would be watching. Chapter 5. Evensong at St. Mildred's was a ritual few in Crampton-Lee would miss, especially after a week as unsettling as this one. But that Sunday, a noticeable gap marred the fourth pew on the left, Simon Bexley's usual seat. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively toward the back, registered the absence without comment. Absences spoke as loudly as appearances, if one had the habit of listening properly. Reverend Bartram's sermon lacked its usual steadiness. He tripped over a passage in Romans, coughed through the final blessing, and left his notes behind on the lectern. Mrs. Petunia Swain dabbed her eyes throughout, though no one was quite sure why. The congregation dispersed quietly, their footsteps muted across the churchyard grass. Miss Marple, as usual, lingered near the lich gate, nodding to villagers as they passed. When the final cluster had gone, she turned to find Dr. Edwin Toller lighting his pipe beneath the yew tree. "Bit of a subdued crowd this evening," she said gently. Dr. Toller exhaled a ribbon of smoke. "Can't say I blame them. Nothing sours the appetite for fellowship like poison." "Especially when it's laced into stew," she murmured. He gave a dry chuckle. "Quite." There was a pause. She let it stretch. "You examined the body before the coroner," she said softly. "Did anything strike you as strange? Beyond the cause of death, I mean." Toller squinted through his smoke. She was holding something. A shred of napkin, clutched it in her fist. A napkin, frayed at the edge, looked like she'd torn it, possibly during the convulsion. I handed it over, but I doubt it's anything. "Even the smallest thread can be telling," Miss Marple murmured. That same evening, Inspector Cray knocked on Miss Marple's cottage door with unusual haste. He looked winded, which she suspected had less to do with distance than irritation. "Simon Bexley is gone," he said, stepping inside without waiting. "Gone?" she asked, setting aside her knitting. "Vanished some time since yesterday. Bicycle missing. No word. I stopped by the station. He never clocked in. Left no note. Nothing." Miss Marple poured him tea without comment. Cray paced. "You were right about that brooch. We questioned a jeweller 2 villages over. He claims Simon tried to sell it last Thursday. Said it was a gift from an aunt. And yet," Miss Marple said lightly, "he kept it." Cray paused. "You think he meant to sell it, but lost his nerve, I think," she said. "It wasn't the brooch he feared being caught with. It was the connection." To Mrs. Bartram. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Affection, even mistaken affection, leaves fingerprints. Cray exhaled. You think it was a lover's quarrel? I think it was something more delicate. Nora Bartram wasn't a woman easily seduced, but she may have needed someone to see her. And young men, as we know, mistake attention for invitation. Cray frowned. So he poisons her stew out of what? Rejection. Miss Marple didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, Is it so hard to imagine he intended only illness, not death? A scare, a gesture, something to make her dependent again. But he used digitalis. Perhaps he didn't know the proper dose. Or perhaps he intended to frighten, not to kill. Cray sat heavily in the armchair, hands rubbing at his temples. And now he's vanished. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Then he must be found, but not chased. Chased men run harder. Hiding men wait. The next morning, Miss Marple wandered towards the railway station. Not the main building, but the storage yard beside it, where old coal bins, crates, and unused gardening tools cluttered the siding. She'd once overheard Simon say it was where he went when he needed quiet, a boy's hiding place tucked between adulthood and regret. She found him in the shed, wrapped in his bicycle blanket, eyes red and unfocused. You shouldn't have come, he muttered. But I did. He didn't move. I didn't mean for her to die, he said after a long silence. She was just going to get sick. She was supposed to rest, need help. Why? Miss Marple asked softly. Simon looked away. She said she cared, that I mattered. Then she said I didn't, that I was a child with a crush. She said I was nothing. And so you used something she wouldn't taste, something she wouldn't notice. I only meant I just wanted her to feel what I felt. Miss Marple didn't speak. She let the quiet settle like dust. She always chose that bowl, he whispered. The bowl, he whispered. The one with the crack in the handle, always. Inspector Cray arrived 10 minutes later. Simon didn't run. He didn't even argue. As the inspector led him away, Miss Marple remained by the shed. Her eyes drifted to the rusted spade leaning against the door-frame, then to the long-forgotten sacks of potash and compost. Even here, poison had waited, in silence, in the hands of someone who didn't understand the weight of consequence until it had fallen. Chapter 6. Simon Bexley's arrest sent a hush over Crampton Lee that felt stranger than shock. There was no triumph in it, no relief, just a quiet, turning inward, as though the village had been embarrassed by the intimacy of the crime. At the vicarage, the curtains remained drawn for 3 days. Mary the maid moved like a ghost through the garden, pausing often near the foxgloves without ever touching them. The vicar delivered his Sunday sermon in a voice thinner than usual, barely audible at times. But Miss Marple, ever exacting in her method, did not consider the matter closed. Simon's confession was incomplete. He had admitted to preparing the poisoned stew, yes. He had described the method. Crushed foxglove leaves, steeped in broth, stirred into the pot just before supper. But he had sworn he used a teaspoon, not a silver serving spoon, and not the one found buried in the garden. Worse still, the dose he described would not have been fatal, which meant someone had intervened. Someone had ensured the dose became deadly. 2 days later, Petunia Swain visited Miss Marple under the pretence of returning a scarf, though her expression betrayed another motive entirely. "He was just a boy," Petunia said, sitting stiffly on the edge of the parlour chair. "He couldn't have known. Nora always took pride in her constitution." "Strong hearts still falter," Miss Marple said gently. Petunia hesitated. "He wasn't the only one, you know. There were others who didn't like Nora, who had reason." Missy Marple poured tea without glancing up. "Do you include yourself in that? She humiliated me," Petunia said flatly. "Called me a busybody, mocked my hair, my figure. Once she even accused me of making eyes at the vicar." "And did you?" Petunia flushed. "That's not the point." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but feelings are rarely tidy, and motives often wear second-hand coats. One mustn't judge their condition too quickly." Petunia fell silent, hands knotting her handkerchief. "Did you ever see her with Simon?" Miss Marple asked casually. Petunia's lips tightened. "She was too old for it, but she liked to be adored, especially by someone who didn't know better. And when she withdrew that affection, she made him feel small," Petunia whispered. "Very small, though kind of small that grows teeth." That same afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage for a word with Mary. The maid answered the door with swollen eyes and flour-dusted hands. "I don't want to speak to the inspector," Mary said, arms folded. "But you, I trust." "I shan't betray your confidence," Miss Marple assured her. They walked slowly through the back garden. The air smelled faintly of mint and fading blooms. "I found something," Mary said quietly. "In the linen cupboard. A napkin, torn." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Frayed at the edge?" Mary nodded. "It was at the bottom of the pile. It smelled odd, bitter. Did you touch it? I wore gloves. I wrapped it in a cloth and left it outside the inspector's office. Anonymous." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Good girl." They paused beside the foxgloves. Mary shivered. "Miss," she said suddenly, "do you think Simon did it all himself?" Miss Marple looked to the soil beneath their feet. "I think Simon began it, but someone else ended it." At twilight, Miss Marple invited Dr. Toller for a quiet supper. He arrived looking weary and curious, though not suspicious. "I've been turning something over in my mind," she said as she poured him soup. "About dosage." He paused mid-spoonful. "Oh?" "You said earlier that the poison was fatal, immediate, but Simon's recipe, if one can call it that, was imprecise. Do you believe it could have been deadly on its own?" Toller set the spoon down. "No, truthfully no, not in that amount. It should have made her ill, violently ill, but not dead." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Then someone enhanced it, or substituted it entirely." She raised an eyebrow. He hesitated. "If, for instance, digitalis had been introduced separately, say, by another spoon, into only her bowl." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "the silver one." "Yes, and digitalis extract, not just crushed leaves. That's pure, precise." She tilted her head. "And who in this village might have access to such a thing?" There was silence. Dr. Toller cleared his throat. "Many households keep old medicine cabinets. Foxglove tincture used to be common in heart tonics. But it would take someone with knowledge to dose it correctly." He didn't answer. She let the silence bloom. That night, Miss Marple sat in her drawing-room with only the ticking clock for company. Simon had made a mistake, a tragic, selfish one, but someone else had made a decision. Simon stirred the pot, but someone else tipped the balance from illness into death. Someone who recognized the signs, who saw what he'd tried to do and made sure it succeeded, perhaps for justice, perhaps for pride. Miss Marple watched the candle flicker low. The final test would not be in a statement. It would be in the silence that followed her next step. Because those who step in to finish a murder don't always believe they've done anything wrong. Chapter 7. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage the next morning with a modest offering. A jar of quince jelly and her usual calm smile. The Reverend greeted her at the door with a distracted nod, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. "You're very kind, Jane," he murmured, ushering her in, "though I'm afraid I haven't much appetite." "It's not for eating," she replied gently. "It's for keeping. Sweetness should be stored when grief lingers. It reminds us the bitterness won't last forever." They sat in the morning room, where the sunlight filtered through yellowed curtains. The house still bore a ghostly hush, as though waiting for Nora to reappear with her ever-disapproving eyebrows and silver ladle. "I've tried to forgive him," Bartram said after a long silence. "In Simon. But I can't yet, and that frightens me." "It's not forgiveness that frightens us," Miss Marple said softly. "It's knowing we must still live with the knowledge." The vicar nodded, then added, "They're coming to clear the last of Nora's things tomorrow. Her jewellery, her clothes, and the silver, already done. Mary polished it all yesterday. Set aside anything with tarnish." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Was anything missing?" "No. At least I don't believe so. Though Mary did mention a spoon had turned up in the linen cupboard." The room seemed to still. "In the linen cupboard," she echoed. He nodded absently. "Odd, isn't it? I'd assumed it had simply been mislaid. One of the large serving ones. She used it that night, I believe. Did you look at it closely?" "No. Would you mind if I did?" Mary was in the pantry, boxing preserves when Miss Marple entered. She didn't look surprised to see her. "You want the spoon?" Mary said. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Mary opened a drawer and pulled it out, wrapped in a folded tea towel. The handle was dull, but Miss Marple's trained eyes caught it immediately. The faintest smudge of powder in the spoon's bowl. A graininess no ordinary stew would leave behind. "Did you find this yourself?" Mary hesitated. "Yes, tucked between folded napkins. I don't think I was meant to." "And you put it with the rest?" "No," she said quickly. "I set it aside. I didn't know what it meant. Still don't. But I knew it wasn't right." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "One more question, dear. Did Dr. Toller visit after the dinner that night, sometime after the guests had left?" Mary thought for a moment. "Yes. He came by, briefly, said he was checking in on the vicar, asked for a cup of tea." "Did he go into the kitchen?" "I suppose so," she said slowly. "I was upstairs turning down the bed." Miss Marple folded the towel back over the spoon. "That evening she sent a note to Dr. Toller, requesting a brief chat under the pretence of discussing old prescriptions. He arrived at her cottage promptly, courteous as ever. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple said as she handed him a glass of Madeira. There's something I've been wondering, and I trust your medical discretion. Of course, suppose someone ingested a small amount of digitalis and survived. What symptoms might they exhibit? He leaned back. Dizziness, vomiting perhaps, heart palpitations. Depending on the amount, it might be mistaken for a flu. But if a higher dose were administered shortly after, then it would be fatal. He nodded. Miss Marple sipped her wine. Would that be noticeable if the poison came from two sources? Possibly, but not if both doses were administered within a short window. She smiled faintly. Then it would look like one efficient dose. Yes. There was a quiet pause. Dr. Toller looked up, suddenly more alert. You're not just asking hypotheticals, are you? Miss Marple didn't answer. You think someone else gave her the second dose? I know someone did, she said evenly. Simon's dose wouldn't have killed her, but someone ensured it would. Toller stood slowly. You suspect me? I do. He turned to go, but she stopped him with a word. Spoon. He paused in the doorway. I found it, she said. In the linen cupboard, the second spoon. The one no one knew was missing, never meant to. He started, then stopped himself. Miss Marple's voice softened. You saw what Simon had done. You realized it wasn't enough, and perhaps in that moment you thought it would be better. For her, for him, for the village. You told yourself she was already slipping away. Toller's expression flickered. She was cruel, Jane. Unrelenting. He was just a child. And you were the one with knowledge, the one who could tip the scale. He met her gaze. I only meant to finish what he began. Miss Marple's voice was low. That makes it murder. He turned away again. And yet you waited to say it. Waited, she said, because I hoped you'd say it first. Chapter 8. Rain arrived by dawn. Steady, quiet, as if the skies themselves wished not to disturb the fragile order of Crampton Lee. Windows remained closed. Conversations happened in hushed tones. The village had the look of a place holding its breath. Miss Marple sat by the parlour window, knitting untouched on her lap, her thoughts returning again and again to the linen cupboard, to the silver spoon, and to Dr. Toller's final words the night before. I only meant to finish what he began. Intent, Miss Marple believed, was never as tidy as motive. And nowhere was that truer than in villages where people knew each other too well to ever say what they truly thought. Later that morning, a soft knock came at the door. She opened it to find Reverend Bartram, soaked through despite his umbrella. I was out walking, he offered by way of explanation, though his colour was askew and his eyes looked bruised with grief. Then come in, dear, she said. Tea? He nodded absently, said, Then come in, dear, she said. Tea? He nodded absently, settling into the chair by the fire. I feel as though the world's gone grey at the edges, he said after a long silence. Everything looks the same, but nothing feels right. Miss Marple poured his tea and waited. Toller came to me this morning, he continued. Told me what he'd done. She gave a slow nod. He wanted my forgiveness, the vicar said, voice low. Wanted absolution, and I couldn't give it. Because he didn't "Ask as a penitent," Miss Marple murmured. "He asked as a man who believes he did something necessary." Bartram's hands trembled slightly around his teacup. "Jane, did you know? Before he came to me, I suspected," she said gently. "The moment the dosage didn't match, the result—" The vicar exhaled, a weary, hollow sound. "He said he found Simon's attempt pathetic, that Nora would recover and humiliate the boy further, that he couldn't let that happen. And what do you believe?" Bartram stared into the flames. "I believe he acted out of pride, and I believe I failed both of them, all of them." Miss Marple's voice was kind but firm. "You're not responsible for the poison, Miles. Only the kitchen." The vicar gave a faint, sad smile. "She hated that kitchen, you know. Said it was too exposed, too open. Everyone walked through it. Guests, the maid, Simon. And yet she insisted on cooking every Tuesday. Perhaps because it was the one place she could control." "And what about you?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Did you feel controlled?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I felt silenced." "And did you ever wish—" "No," he interrupted quickly. "Never." The fire crackled, but I knew she was unwell. I knew her mind was growing thin in places. I should have insisted she rest. I should have said something, anything." "Silence," Miss Marple said quietly, "can be its own kind of harm, but it is not the same as intent." That afternoon, Inspector Cray arrived with a grim expression and a case file under his arm. "Dr. Toller turned himself in," he announced. "Confessed to everything. Said he didn't plan it, not at first. But when he saw what Simon had done, he made a decision." Miss Marple nodded. "He used the second spoon." Cray's eyes narrowed. "How did you know there were two?" "I found it in the linen cupboard. He likely tucked it away while Mary was upstairs." Cray rubbed his temple. "We'll test both utensils, but it adds up. The dosage discrepancy, the timing, the residue." "What will happen to Simon?" "He'll be tried," Cray said, "but likely not for murder. Attempted poisoning, perhaps. His confession works in his favor, ironically." "And Dr. Toller?" Cray's voice hardened. "He'll face full charges. Knowledge of poison makes it worse. It wasn't rash. It was calculated." Miss Marple said nothing. Cray studied her for a moment. "You knew this village better than any of us. How did you know it wasn't over with Simon?" She folded her hands. "Because the harm felt too clean, too complete. Simon's act was clumsy, emotional. But Nora's death had symmetry. Someone made sure the mess was wiped up before it started." Cray nodded slowly. "You saw the pattern." "I watched," she corrected. "That's all I ever do." By evening, the rain had stopped. The clouds broke enough for a pale slice of sun to warm the rose trellis outside Miss Marple's window. She sat with her notebook, reviewing the final lines of the puzzle. Motive: humiliation, masked as protection, means a known poison, delivered in the quietest way. Opportunity: a moment in a busy kitchen, unnoticed. Trigger: the belief that mercy and murder were cousins. She closed the notebook with a sigh. There would be trials. There would be consequences. But there would not be peace. Because in villages like Crampton Lee, it wasn't justice that lingered. It was memory. Chapter 9. The following morning dawned unusually quiet, the sort of quiet that lingers after something decisive has passed. Crampton Lee felt changed, its stillness not of peace, but of aftermath. Miss Marple took her breakfast late and slow, one hand cradling a soft-boiled egg, the other resting on a letter that had arrived without fanfare. The envelope bore no return address, just a neat hand that spoke of deliberate calm. Inside, a folded page, a short note. "You were right. I didn't act out of mercy. I acted because she frightened me, not with threats, but with the truth of what I saw in myself when she looked at me. It wasn't justice. It wasn't kindness. I only wanted silence again." E.T. Miss Marple folded the letter, set it beneath the blue china teapot on the table, and sat with it there for a long while. There was nothing left to reply, only the silence he had craved, now his alone. Later that day, Mary the maid knocked on Miss Marple's door with a brown paper parcel in her arms. She looked tired but steadier, like someone who'd begun, at last, to breathe again. "This was in the back of the kitchen drawer," Mary said, setting it on the table. "We've been cleaning everything. Nora's old things. I thought perhaps you ought to have a look before the rest gets taken away." Miss Marple nodded gently and untied the twine. Inside were folded recipe cards, inked in Nora Bartram's narrow, precise hand, one for every week's meal, each dated, each annotated, in neat pencil margins. Tuesday stew, Wednesday ham, Friday soup. "Such an orderly woman," Miss Marple murmured, even in her taste for chaos. Mary lingered. "Do you think she knew?" Miss Marple looked up. "About Simon's intention." She knew. Miss Marple looked up. "About Simon's intention." "About Dr. Toller. About the poison." There was a pause before Miss Marple answered. "I think she suspected something, but not from them. I believe she thought someone else might harm her. And so she kept records, patterns, who ate what, who served, what time the stew was stirred." Mary's eyes widened. "Like a diary?" "A diary in dinners," Miss Marple said softly. Afternoon, she returned to the vicarage, by now a house trying awkwardly to forget itself. Reverend Bartram met her in the hallway, subdued but collected. "I'd like to see her writing desk," Miss Marple said, "if it's not too forward." He led her upstairs, opened the narrow door to a quiet room. Nora's desk sat by the window, the chair still pushed just so. On the writing surface, beneath an ivory paperweight, lay a sealed envelope. It was addressed simply, "In the event of my death." Bartram stared at it as though it might leap away. "I didn't see it until this morning," he whispered. "It was tucked under the blotter." "Would you mind if I—" He shook his head. Miss Marple opened the envelope with care. Inside, a single page. "If something happens to me, know that I feared not one enemy, but many eyes. I have lived too long, watching the good pretend not to see the rot beneath their gardens. If it is poison, it will come from my own kitchen, not a stranger's. And someone will know. Someone always knows." Nick and B. Bartram sat down hard on the edge of the bed. "She knew," he whispered, "and she forgave no one." "No," Miss Marple said quietly, "but she prepared." Later, Miss Marple walked alone through the village, her steps leading her past the post office, the bakery, the church with its quiet bells. Everyone nodded gently now, not with curiosity but a kind of reverence, the sort reserved for things too sad to discuss openly. She paused at the war memorial, where foxglove bloomed a little too early for the season. A wild sprig had taken root between the stones. She bent to pluck it, fingers brushing its stem, not carelessly, but with full awareness of what it could do. Poison was never just in the plant, it was in the person who chose it. Back at her cottage, she opened the drawer beneath the sitting-room window and retrieved a final item, her own small notebook, the one she kept for cases like this. Nothing official, nothing for police, just a record for the truth. She wrote in her delicate hand. Conclusion. Simon Bexley introduced poison into the communal stew. Immature motive, limited understanding. Dr. Edwin Toller enhanced the poison via second delivery, silver spoon, linen cupboard concealment, precise dosing. Nora Bartram suspected danger, kept culinary records, wrote anticipatory note. Motive for murder. Power reclaimed through silencing. Final cause of death. Digitalis-induced cardiac arrest. Justice. To be served, albeit imperfectly. Truth. Buried, but not forgotten. She underlined the final line, closed the book, and returned it to its place. All the threads had been tied, all the questions laid bare. The rest was grief and reflection. Chapter 10. It was the third Sunday after the funeral when the rosebush bloomed. Not just any rosebush, Nora Bartram pride. A pale blush-coloured hybrid named Emily's Quiet, planted on a whim years ago and tended with exacting care. It had refused to flower for 2 seasons. Now it stood in full bloom beside the vicarage kitchen door, flushed and fragrant, as if daring the village to forget what had passed beside it. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the garden's edge, observed the petals with something between fondness and suspicion. Nature, she murmured, always returns, but it rarely returns kindly. Mary the maid had joined her, hands folded neatly in her apron. "It feels wrong," Mary said. "Something lovely growing in the spot where something awful happened." Miss Marple looked at her. "Life has no sense of timing. It simply insists on going forward." Mary hesitated. "Will they tear down the kitchen?" "No," said Miss Marple gently. "They'll repaint it, scrub it, until it forgets." Inside the vicarage, Reverend Bartram moved like a man reacquainting himself with solitude. His study had been cleared of all Nora's embroidery, and the china cabinet stood half empty. The Tuesday supper set had been packed away and donated to the parish sale. He met Miss Marple in the sitting-room that afternoon, with tea already steeping, just strong enough, and without sugar. "She hated sugar," he said, half smiling. "Said it dulled the palate. Now I can't take it any other way." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the clock strike 3. "You'll stay on at the vicarage?" Miss Marple asked. "For now," Bartram said. "There are still sermons to write, people to bury." "And to marry," she said lightly. He chuckled, then sobered. "I've thought a great deal these past weeks. About silence. About how many years I spent in one that wasn't holy." Miss Marple said nothing. She let him speak. "I never poisoned her, Jane. I never wished her dead. But I did wish her quiet. I wished she would leave me alone." He stared into his teacup. "I've learned," he added softly, "that silence isn't peace. It's what grows when words are too afraid to rise." Miss Marple placed her cup down gently. "And what grows after silence depends on what we plant next." He looked at her, eyes shining slightly. "You always know how to say the thing that isn't cruel." She gave a faint smile. "It's taken a lifetime of listening." The following day, Inspector Cray stopped Miss Marple outside the post office with the final news. "Tuller's arraignment is set," he said. "Full confession submitted. Simon will face lesser charges: tampering, intent to harm, likely probation with supervision." "And the village?" she asked. Cray sighed. "They're swallowing it, slowly." "Not all poison comes in stew," she said quietly. "Some comes in the form of shame. It spreads slower, but lingers longer." Cray tipped his hat. "If I may say, thank you, Miss Marple, for not just solving it, for naming it. That's harder in the end." She gave him a kind look. "Justice without truth is a hollow verdict." Spring pressed forward. The Tuesday suppers ceased, replaced by quiet charity luncheons, hosted by Petunia Swain, where conversation was light and food notably bland. Simon Bexley returned to work under supervision in the village sorting room. He said little, wrote letters home, never looked anyone in the eye for more than a few seconds. Dr. Toller's cottage stood empty, and the foxglove in the vicarage garden was uprooted by Mary, without fanfare, one rainy evening. But the rose remained. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, Miss Marple took out her notebook one last time. She added 3 lines beneath the final entry. "Residual harm. The boy mistook obsession for love. The doctor mistook calculation for mercy. The village mistook familiarity for safety." She closed the notebook and placed it on her shelf, between household remedies of the 17th century and village vices and virtues. An oral history. Outside, a breeze passed through the garden gate. The rose swayed without shedding a single petal. In the kitchen, her kettle began to whistle. She rose calmly and made herself a cup of tea. 1 spoon of sugar, not 2, because sweetness, like peace, should be measured carefully. Chapter 11. The dark cupboard door beneath the vicarage stairs was rarely used. It had once held the vicar's gardening boots, a broken umbrella, and, briefly, Nora Bartram's mother's tea set, but over the years it became little more than a quiet corner, forgotten, left shut, until the day Miss Marple returned unannounced to bid the house a final goodbye. She found Mary in the hall, her apron dusted with flour and her hair pinned back with soft precision. "Everything's been cleared now," Mary said. "The police gave back the last of the evidence. Inspector Cray said they'll be closing the file this week. I'd like to see the kitchen once more," Miss Marple said gently, "for the memory of it." Mary nodded. "Of course." The kitchen was spotless, quiet, save for the soft hum of the old clock on the shelf. The copper pots gleamed with recent polish. There were no ghosts in the air, but there were shadows. Miss Marple moved with slow intention, pausing where Nora had stood with the stew, where the silver ladle had hung, where the drawer had hidden the first spoon. Then she crossed the floor turned and looked back at the room from the angle of the doorway. And there, just behind the coat stand, was the stair cupboard. "I don't suppose you've looked in there?" Miss Marple asked casually. Mary shook her head. "Not since, well, not in years." Miss Marple stepped forward and opened it. Dust drifted into the air. There, on the top shelf, was a folded quilt, a narrow wooden box, and something else, a stack of letters bound with twine, ground at the edges. She drew them down carefully. Mary hovered at her side. "They're addressed to the vicar," Miss Marple said. "Everyone." They took the bundle into the sitting-room. The Reverend arrived minutes later, having been summoned with a quiet urgency. When he saw the letters, he paled. "They're hers," he said softly. "Nora's." He took the top one and opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable. "You always said I left no space for you, that you could not breathe near me. So I have decided to give you that space on paper. Here I will not interrupt. I will not correct. I will only confess." He read in silence for several minutes, then handed the letter back without speaking. "She wrote them?" Miss Marple asked. "Over several months," he said. "I never knew. She must have hidden them there." "I suppose she couldn't say it out loud. Grief," Miss Marple murmured, "has a way of leaving behind truths that are too late for forgiveness, but not too late for understanding." He nodded. "She wrote about her fears, about Simon, about her sense of something going wrong." "She knew someone meant her harm," Mary said softly. "She suspected," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But she didn't know who." Vicar opened another letter. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. "I'm tired of fighting shadows, of stirring stew with the sense someone is behind me. I don't want to become the sort of woman who suspects kindness. But something has shifted. I fear I have allowed affection to cloud my judgment. I fear I've made someone angry, and I fear they will not stop at anger." He lowered the page. "She wrote it 2 weeks before she died." That evening, back in her own cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her final pot of tea. Outside, dusk collected along the eaves like ash, silent and slow. All threads had now drawn inward. Simon, with his youthful obsession, had been the first to stir the water. Dr. Toller, with his quiet judgment, had ensured it boiled. Nora, through suspicion and silence, had written her own eulogy before anyone else knew to mourn. And the village, so ordinary in its denial, had almost missed the lesson altogether. Miss Marple reflected not on guilt, but on intention, how deeply it lay beneath the surface of every act, even in a kitchen, especially in a kitchen. She opened her notebook one final time, not to revise, but to conclude. Final reasoning. Simon Bexley introduced the first dose. Emotional motive. Poor knowledge of consequences. Dr. Edwin Toller delivered the fatal dose, justified by his own sense of moral superiority. The silver spoon, buried and recovered, confirmed the separate origin of the final poison. Nora Bartram's letters revealed she anticipated harm, but chose silence over scandal. The vicar remained unaware, but complicit through years of quiet retreat. The crime was not one act, but two, not one motive, but layered ones. The murder succeeded not just through poison, but through omission, fear, and the village's unwillingness to believe harm could grow in familiar soil. She set down her pen. It was done. Outside her window, a robin landed on the sill and tilted its head toward the inside. Miss Marple met its gaze with calm eyes. Not all killers wore rage on their sleeves. Some wore kindness pressed and folded, like a linen napkin hiding a tarnished spoon. Chapter 12. The spring fair came late that year. Delayed by rain and scandal, its bunting was thinner than usual, and its pastries more tentative. Still, the villagers of Crampton Lee turned up in coats and polished shoes, as if normalcy was something one could simply dress for. Miss Marple walked the narrow paths between stalls, politely declining sponge cake, smiling at seed packet displays, and making a point to greet everyone, especially those who had avoided her eyes in recent weeks. At the edge of the green, Petunia Swain manned the church donation table. Her usual sharpness was muted today, replaced by an almost careful grace. "We've raised enough for new hymnals," she said, "and for new kitchen linens." Miss Marple's brows lifted ever so slightly. A fresh start in the vicarage kitchen. Then Petunia's smile was tight. "There are stains you can't wash out, Jane, but you can cover them. Sometimes that's all people need." Back at her cottage, the kettle sang its familiar note. Miss Marple moved slowly, methodically, one tea bag, one slice of lemon. No sugar this time. Outside the clouds were clearing, a patch of pale blue stretching cautiously above the hedgerows. She carried the tea to her sitting room, where the tray had been set with 2 cups. Only one would be used. She looked at the other. Delicate porcelain, rimmed with faded gold. It had belonged to her Aunt Clara. She used it only for guests she trusted, or those whose confessions came not in words, but in the way their hands trembled on the saucer. It remained untouched, not because no one had come, but because everything had already been said. The letter from Dr. Toller arrived the following day, postmarked from the county prison hospital. "Miss Marple, I was wrong, not just in what I did, but in believing I was above consequences. You were right. My knowledge did not make the act righteous. It made it precise. That is not the same as just tell the Reverend I pray for him every day, not for his forgiveness, but for his peace." Miss Marple folded the letter and slipped it between the pages of her gardening almanac. Where memory belonged, not displayed, but not denied. By month's end, Simon Bexley had resumed his rounds, delivering post with a slower, more deliberate gait. He no longer nodded to everyone. He nodded to those who had the decency not to flinch. At the bakery, Mrs. Crouch whispered that he'd written to his aunt in Wales, asking to move away in the summer. "He's a good boy under it all," she said, "but Crampton Lee doesn't forget easily." Miss Marple had only nodded. Forgetting was not the problem. The village had always been excellent at forgetting. It was remembering correctly that took effort. One evening near midsummer, Miss Marple visited the church garden. The foxglove had not returned. In its place, someone, likely Mary, had planted rosemary for remembrance. Miss Marple stooped near the roots, brushing her fingers gently across the herb's silvery green leaves. Its scent clung faintly to her gloves. Behind her, footsteps. She turned to see Reverend Bartram approaching. hands folded in front of him. "She would have hated rosemary," he said softly. "Then it's the perfect choice," Miss Marple replied. "We plant what the dead won't approve of. It's how we learn to live again." He smiled faintly. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "No need," she replied. "I only ever listen." "You do more than that. You remind us how much the listening matters." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Grief is loud, but truth is patient." They stood together for a long while, watching the wind pass through the hedgerow. The silence that grew between them was not the kind that divides, but the kind that heals. That night, back at her cottage, Miss Marple wrote one final entry in her case ledger. She did not need to, but she did it all the same. Aftermath, the kitchen, was not cursed. It was ordinary. That's why the crime could happen there. Simon Bexley left Crampton Lee before autumn. Whether he found peace is unknown. Dr. Edwin Toller's sentence was reduced in exchange for full cooperation. He died 2 years later in custody. Reverend Bartram remained, a gentler preacher, a lonelier man. The rose bush bloomed again the following year. So did the rosemary. She closed the notebook. Not every story ends with resolution, but this one had, quietly, thoroughly, and with care. The mystery was solved, the damage measured, the village changed, and in a kitchen somewhere, someone stirred. A pot with clean hands, watched by a woman who knew that the most dangerous thing in the world was not poison, but love misunderstood.